Okay, so Jennifer, the judge was just giving us, and I want to give you an opportunity to speak about judicial temperament. And I love that quote about "Be humble. This bench belongs not to you, but to the people." That's really says a lot when somebody puts something there to can remind them, because it's tense, and you deal with. For lack of a better word, hostage negotiations in family court. Yeah. It's very, very intense. So. What do you, as a family law attorney, have you noticed like a lot of controversies between the lawyers and the way they lawyer, and in the court the way the judges are treating the litigants? Because maybe it's just here in my neck of the woods, but it's a very tense environment between adversaries and judges. Thoughts?
Oh, sure. It certainly can be between the lawyers and also with the judge. Usually the judge is the first one to draw blood. And that's especially what's so impressive about this judge. Like we've been saying, his temperament is just excellent. Extremely tense circumstances. Obviously, the stakes are incredibly high here. And the way he handled the defendant and also that expert who ultimately was disqualified, it's impressive how he presents himself very calmly and also effectively but appropriately. He didn't advise the defendant. He can't do that. But he just stop short of saying, listen, if you don't proceed with your case, you will be sentenced to death, because that's what the law says, effectively what has to happen. That's
essentially what he said, Jennifer. You're right on. You know, listen, I've said, and I'd love to see what our chatters think about this and our viewers, that when I'm consulted by political people that make big decisions in terms of appointments and elections of judges and prosecutors, that I think that the #1 criminal justice system problem that we have is, unfortunately, the diminution of quality of, we need more Judge Coffees. There's a picture of him right now. We need more Judge Birminghams. We need prosecutors who are mad skills that can balance mercy and justice and compassion and deterrence and punishment. And I think that I really believe that this is a major issue of public importance, and uniform and codified policies in the criminal justice system come from people with great experience like Judge Coffey and Judge Birmingham. So thank you, Jennifer. Listen, in the mitigation phase, or rather aggravation phase of a case, victim impact testimony, as I was talking to the judge before, is probably one of the most powerful things left next to the actual crime itself. So let's go into court and see a clip from earlier of the family members of the police officer who now bear the burden of the collateral consequences of the heinous act of the defendant convicted of capital murder, Tremaine Wilbourn. Wow. Okay. So Jennifer, it's my postulation as a former death penalty, murder, homicide prosecutor, that this kind of testimony is very, very impactful. And I just want to ask you a question and how it may relate to your field. You know, we're used to dealing with this. You just deal with one case, the next case, the next case. You see horrible things. You're going into crime scenes. You're seeing blood all over. You're seeing this, and you get pictures, and you're introducing them. But every now and again, you reflect upon, what if I ever got a call to tell me, or I was watching TV and found out that somebody I love so dearly was just taken away? It brings a completely different reality when we bring ourselves into the cases we try. Does it not for you?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure the jurors are sitting there right now thinking, gosh, I can only imagine if I found out one of my loved ones was murdered, and I'm watching the news and that's how I find out. That's unbelievable that that's how his mother found out. A couple of interesting things that the state is doing here. I think it's interesting how they introduced some stories that were rather light. The story about the bow tie with the picture, and also about how his brother loved the color pink. I think that those types of things really resonate with the jury. Certainly the heavy stuff does as well, and that's perhaps the most compelling. But I think these moments of levity are also helpful and relatable to the jury. Also, the fact that they talk about how these young men had a tough upbringing is pretty compelling. I think that the state could probably make the argument that the defendant had a tough upbringing, but obviously these two men took very different paths. Not apples to apples, but there's an argument there.
I think that's a phenomenal point, Jennifer, and I would just add to it, I think there's also a piece where the prosecutor's trying to soften the image of a police officer in his uniform and showing the human being behind the bulletproof vest that was shot in the face and killed. All excellent points as always, Jennifer. We got to go to a break in a sad, unfortunate case. We'll be back on the other end. Okay, welcome back. So that Memphis police officer, Jennifer, I think is another powerful witness. What are your thoughts?
Absolutely. You know, we heard from the brother, but now we're hearing from a colleague. And when we've got a professional who was the victim here, it's often critical to hear about who they were as a professional. And this witness is speaking to the fact that this was a good cop. He was respected in the community by lots of different folks. And in fact, there were other police officers, if I'm hearing this correctly, who were so adversely affected by this that they left the department.
Yeah, I think that another thing is it goes back to the same theme again, where the prosecutor's trying to show and also dismantle, if the defendant takes the stand, this idea that this racial trauma reaction to this officer. They're really humanizing the officer as a human being, and as you've indicated, I mean, unfortunately, optics are what they are, and I hate to talk about this, but you have a black police officer that's on the witness stand talking about how this guy was well regarded in the community. He was a community officer. He's not one of these cops that we've seen in other cases, unfortunately, that has victimized the African-American community or minority community in particular. This witness is specifically, in my mind, there to say that's not this cop.
Right, and that race-based trauma could very well exist. The defense doesn't have an expert that can say that, but it could very well exist. But what this witness can offer is the fact that this wasn't that type of cop. And in fact, we know from other evidence, this cop didn't even pull out his gun, never fired one shot, which is especially critical here because it for sure diffuses that argument that the defendant, in fact, felt panicked and that he was being threatened by this police officer.
You know, I'll just take a little roundabout with you about this, and I don't mean to be controversial. I'm just throwing it out there for purposes of our audience to contemplate, so nobody needs to go apoplectic when I bring up these issues, which I'm sure somebody will. There is a cycle of problematic police-community relations that are going on, and it's being amped up where both sides, good people on both sides, are feeling as if they're in an adversarial position with one another. Now, I went through the firearms training, and I know that's pretty consistent around the country that they say the #1 way a cop will not go home is a result of a motor vehicle stop gone awry. That is the singular #1 way a cop is going to be killed. And this is an example of what, you know, then they get nervous, and then they're on their guns, and then the people that are in the cars, they're nervous, and this tension gets escalated. Sometimes there's arguments, sometimes there's resistance, sometimes there's flight, sometimes there's assault, and people get hurt. What are your thoughts? Is the testimony here to say that's not this guy?
Yeah, you know, I think that there's an argument that even if it isn't this guy, that doesn't mean that the defendant didn't have that state of mind that he possibly had because of what's going on in this country. Like you said, you'd have to be living under a rock to not know what a polarizing, controversial issue this is. You know, and the sad reality is, I was talking about this with a colleague, is that this was a lose-lose situation. I mean, given the environment that we live in today, it seems like it was most likely one of these gentlemen wasn't going to walk away alive or at least seriously injured as a result of this incident.
Right, and it just, all it does is amp up on the other side. I told you so from the police community, and understandably so, that if you are not watching and hyper vigilant, you can be gone in a heartbeat. It is really a vexing problem, but there's no question about the fact the prosecution is doing a great job saying that is not this police officer, Sean Bolton, 33 years old, and they're putting on witnesses to show the huge impact this has had on his family as well as the community. Let's listen to some more testimony.
Copy.
Okay, welcome back on the Wilbourn case. That's a probation officer testifying. My producer said I get to ask one question. So wait till you listen to this question, Jennifer, because I only get one. Okay, this probation officer is testifying about a previous incident, a bank robbery, mass guns, people on the ground. They're allowed to get out. All this data, all this information, all this previous crime stuff, and previous felonies can be considered an aggravating factor. When we were doing death penalty, when it was lawful in New Jersey, you would not be able to get into the details of those prior convictions. You would only be able to get into the fact that there were convictions. Otherwise, they would say it would be unduly prejudicial and blah, blah, blah. Here's my question as I keep going. This is really hurtful testimony to the defendant, especially in light of all the people whose lives have been affected.
Oh, gosh, yeah. I mean, the jury has to answer the question, does this defendant continue to pose a threat to society? And we're hearing, obviously, about his criminal history. Not only his criminal history, his violent criminal history. I mean, just imagery that this woman's words provoke. I mean, the fact that he had the victims lying on the floor of the bank, I mean, that's enough to make anyone get chills. And I'm sure that's exactly what's happening with the jurors right now. I mean, so they're hearing about these details of how this man really has a violent criminal past.
Yeah, this is again that kind of testimony that says, that could have been me, my wife, my husband, my brother, my sister, my kids that were inside of a bank. Not good for him. But I'll tell you what, I think I have the longest question on record in law and crime history. I'm very proud of that. We'll go on a break. We'll be right back. Okay, so Jennifer, we got a couple of minutes before we have to sign off because, you know, the next, like, unbelievably covetous host that everyone wants from fame and fortune from coast to coast is actually sitting right next to me right now, and I got the people in the chat room trying to guess who it is. But before we go there, Jennifer, you've been giving some great commentary. As always, it's always a pleasure to have you on the show. What do you think so far in terms of the penalty phase, how this is going for the prosecution, and if you were on the defense side, what would you do?
I mean, there's lots of aggravating factors here, starting with this defendant's long, violent criminal history. Also, this witness here is speaking to the fact that the officer never drew his weapon. There were no shots fired on behalf of the officer. So it's not looking good for the defense. I think the defendant's best bet at this point is to present evidence of his character, family members, community members like that pastor, speaking to how this defendant has some redeeming qualities that make his life worth saving.
You know, I think it's important to let our audience know in 30 seconds or less, Jennifer, that you got to remember when a death penalty jury is picked, you have to say that you agree with the law, that you would, in fact, impose a death penalty. They prove the aggravating factors outweigh the mitigating.
Right, absolutely. But the defense needs to bank on the fact that at least one of those juries in Tennessee, one of those jurors, excuse me, is going to say, no, I don't think the death penalty will be imposed. And a lot of times when it comes down to it, they end up changing their minds in the heat of the moment.
Yeah, well, these estates down here are pretty conservative. I said often before, the facts are not good. Guys, listen, Jennifer, thank you so much again from Chicago for all the great advice. Can't wait to have you on again. Guys, it's been a pleasure being on. My time has come to an end. I'll be back Wednesday from 12 to 3. And next, you will have the amazing Misty Maris. Be well.